So I will call us to order. And Kayla can read the roll.
All right, thank you, Linda. Diane. I did receive regrets in advance from the following commissioners that are not able to join us this evening. Michael Fern, Molly Kleinman, Liz Margolis, Kyra Sims, and Howard Lazarus. For the remaining commissioners, I will now call the roll. Please say here.
Robert Gordon let us know ahead of time as well.
Oh, he did.
He's
You're
in
right.
Arizona
Sorry.
or something.
That one, and Robert Gordon as well. So I will start with Commissioner Boland. Here. Commissioner Felt.
Here?
Councilmember Griswold. Commissioner Hull.
Here.
Commissioner Nahidi.
Here.
Commissioner Parsons.
Here.
Commissioner Trudeau.
Here.
Sergeant Bell Clock.
And I just got a text from Sergeant Clock that he's actually on patrol tonight and responding to an incident, and he sends his regrets as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Dolan. Commissioner Hess.
Here.
Commissioner Webb. We do have a quorum.
Just barely, but
Just
yes.
barely.
Maybe everybody's vacationing in warm places. We've moved the agenda and the minutes to a consent agenda so that we can dispatch with it more readily. And so if anyone has any objections or changes to the agenda or the minutes, all you have to do is just ask them to be pulled from the consent agenda, and we can deal with that. So I'll take a motion to approve the minutes and the consent agenda.
Parsons?
Okay, seconded by,
Yeah.
great. Any discussion? Not supposed to have discussion on consent agenda. Sorry. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. And then we have public commentary, and you're allowed 3 minutes to speak, which Kayla will track. Is there anybody from the public who'd like to speak? All right, we're ahead of time then. Let's keep going. We have a presentation, I believe, with Eli Cooper.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. For those of you in the public, my name is Eli Cooper. I am the city's Transportation Program Manager, and I'm here to present information about a recent quiet zone assessment that has been conducted in the city. The quiet zone was assessed based on citizen input on the reaction to train horn noise. This has been an issue in the city dating back to at least the early to mid 1990s, and has come up from time to time. In response to recent complaints, SRF Consulting was brought on board. They have substantial knowledge and experience in quiet zone analysis, and worked with us as we prepared this report. The report is available on a quiet zone webpage on the city's website, and we would invite the commission members as well as citizens at home to read through the report. And there's a simple survey that's associated with that information. That survey will be open for about the next 3 weeks until mid-March, and that will help inform the city as we move forward. The quiet zone area that we studied is the north-south railroad corridor, the Ann Arbor Railroad. There are, in fact, 2 railroad corridors in Ann Arbor. The Michigan line runs along the Huron River, more or less, and carries the Amtrak service. The line that we did the quiet zone analysis runs closer to the downtown and through the north side neighborhoods. Train horn rule has been around since the city's heard complaints about train horns. I think there's something corresponding about the federal government recognizing train horns are a safety device, requiring railroad operators to sound them, and input from the public. The rules that we're operating under were put in effect in 2005. What does a quiet zone do? In essence, a quiet zone eliminates the requirement for the routine sounding of train horn at grade crossings. It does not eliminate all train horn soundings. I want to be clear that an engineer in a train, if he sees a person or an animal on the tracks and the train horn is a way to avert an emergency, they can sound their train horns. Construction activity around the track, also the engineer has the right to advise construction workers and the like. So the routine trains going north and south through the city would not be required, but in an instance, and they're, I'll say rare, but sometimes less infrequent depending on the conditions that the railroad's operating in, you would still hear train horns from time to time. There are some minimum requirements. The FRA says if you're going to have a quiet zone, it needs to be at least a half a mile long, and all public crossings need to have certain minimum features. Those minimum features include gates and flashing lights, and I'll show you in a slide where those exist in Ann Arbor today on this corridor. Power out indicators so that the public could know when gates won't operate because there's no power. And constant warning time detectors, which is a piece of infrastructure that's specific to making sure that the train and the gates going down are generally timed according to constant. There are some trains are a little faster, a little slower, and the issue is to have a predictable time variance. The crossing conditions in the city, and I mentioned that I would talk about which ones have gates, and it's simple. If you look at the list up in front of you, you'll see only one yes with gates, and that's Duvarn. The rest do not have gates, and if we were to move forward as a community with a quiet zone, all those no's would need to be flipped up to yeses. The reason that we needed to bring a firm in to assist us is that there are risk analyses that are best left to be done by experts. And what I'm going to do now is walk through a couple of images that show you what the summary of the analysis looks like and how a community could qualify for installation of a quiet zone. So in this first slide, you'll notice that there's this is an indication of the level of safety with the train horn in place. And that is the top of the vertical bars. And what you see is that there's also a risk index with horns, and there's also a national significant risk threshold. Those lines are important as we move forward in this discussion, but in the current instance, what you can see is the level of risk overall is that risk index with horn, and some of these example streets, 2 are below the risk index with horns, and 1 is above it based on safety analysis of the conditions of those crossings. Hypothetical, so don't ask me what's the difference. Just it illustrates that some could be higher, some could be lower based on traffic, things of that nature. The first thing that we need to understand is if the train horn is silenced, the risk index goes up. So the blue bars are from the previous slide that shows the risk index with horns. If the horns are silenced, the red bars show you what the baseline noise index would be, excuse me, with the increase in, or say it conversely, the decrease in safety at each of the crossings. And so you can see there's a significant value in the train horns in that when you silence them, the overall index is increased dramatically. The next slide shows the green vertical bars illustrate what the train safety index would be with safety gates. And so in this instance, you see a dramatic reduction in the height, if you will, of the green bars compared to both the red and the blue. And then as you look at the lines on the right side, you'll see the baseline index, you'll see the national standard, and you'll see that the gates would bring it well below, which in this example would qualify for implementation of the quiet zone. One of the attributes of this entire process is you do have to make the minimum improvements at each location, but you don't have to make all of the improvements at all of the locations. So they'll all have gates, but there are other things that I'll introduce. And this shows that if, for example, one of the crossings didn't have the improvements, you see that the safety is as the same as the risk without horns, but overall, the overall quiet zone noise index or risk index is lower than a national standard, so this would still qualify. Just means it gives us some latitude and flexibility. We're required to meet the minimum conditions everywhere, but there's additional safety improvements that are more or less optional, depending on the characteristics of the crossings and the safety statistics. These additional items are called supplemental safety measures, and I've got 4 of them shown. Four-way gate, which is normal gate, you'll see the gate go down on the side where vehicles are approaching in the lane that's facing the tracks, but there's no gate on the other side, so that if someone is in the grade crossing, they could exit it. In a 4-quadrant gate, there are gates that come down and completely close both sides. Now, there's a timing issue so that if you're in after the gate goes down, you can still exit the crossing. So it's a little more complicated electronics and a bit more physical infrastructure. There's a concrete median that if you're in a lane that's approaching a grade crossing and the gate comes down and you're impatient, if there's no median there, you can pass the car in front of you, and if it's only a 2-quadrant gate, you might see an open railroad crossing. This really restricts the movement. The delineators that are next to the channelization island is another effective tool of keeping traffic in line. And one of the options discussed, if we have crossings that are of extremely low vehicular traffic and there are nearby streets that otherwise serve those connections, the crossings could be closed, completely eliminating the risk of a vehicle-train collision. Some of these standard safety measures, if you will, have a minimum requirement, 100 foot in length. What if you don't have 100 feet? Well, you can do a partial, and those are called alternative safety measures, and the ASMs are shown in this image. You can see the railroad with the street, and there are intersecting streets on both sides of the railroad crossing, but there are channelization islands, but they're less than the 100 feet that an SSM would be described as. On October 8th, we had our diagnostic meeting. We looked at all 21 crossings. It was a broad interdisciplinary team that included railroad staff, railroad management, FRA staff was in, MDOT staff, city engineers, as well as the private crossing stakeholders. There are a couple of private crossings on the corridor that are within the area. We looked at each of these 21 crossings, and this slide shows on the left side the existing condition at the State Street at the railroad crossing. The second or middle slide shows little blue lines that come across the vehicular lanes that are approaching the railroad crossing. That would be an illustration of what a simple gates-only strategy would look like. And then the image on the right shows the red lines where medians could be constructed, and those would be supplemental safety measures. The reason that I use this example is because it shows you the base improvement, which is gates and signals only, compared to something where we would have SSMs, supplemental safety measures. As a result of our analysis looking at the entire corridor, the report goes into greater detail. My time's limited, but there's about $6.7 million worth of gates and signal improvements that are necessary in order to implement quiet zone through the entire corridor. There are scenarios that look at adding some SSM, supplemental safety measures, based on cost effectiveness. There's a maximum safety approach, and there's also a recommendation that because the length of the corridor in Ann Arbor, we could install it in segments, north segment, south segment. So what the cost would be to use logical segments for implementation. Where we are now is we're in the process of determining necessary crossing improvements. Be interested to hear from the commission as to your reaction to this. If we, as a community, make a decision to move forward, we would follow the next 4 steps, which is to notify all appropriate agencies, MDOT, FRA, the railroad with a notice of intent. We'd provide a formal application to FRA. It would take them about a year to review our application. Once they would authorize what we are proposing as being adequate, we would initiate the construction, and then once the installations are complete, formal notification would be made, and the train engineers would be noticed to no longer sound their horns. As you can see, based on SRF's experience, typically once we make a decision, it's going to be about a year or 2 until we would actually achieve an FRA compliant quiet zone. The quiet zone decision process balances the goals of quality of life and safety with the costs that have been outlined. And we look forward to receiving input from the commission here this evening, as well as I mentioned earlier, there is an online survey available for citizens to let us know, or they can send me an email at ecooper@a2gov.org. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Eli, thanks for the presentation. How would that potential for high-speed rail affect that, or would it just not?
So the Ann Arbor Railroad North-South is what they call a short line railroad.
Okay.
It conveys freight in and out of Ann Arbor. The high-speed runs on the Michigan line, so that is not addressed at all with this quiet zone study.
Okay. And then just the other thing I want to comment on, I assume that if you did the gates and still had the horn, it would be even safer than gates without the horn. Right, so I assume.
I will allow you to assume as much. What I will do is I'll have to go back and check with the calculations and the indexes, because I'm not familiar with whether, since they're somewhat redundant, but I believe that in a broader sense, the horn advertises to the entire community, so that's a high level of safety, and then the gates are more specifically directed to those locations. So it's probably like a belt and suspenders, but I'm not in a place to say that's better.
Sure. Yeah.
I'll get back to you.
I just want to be sure that we're balancing safety versus quality of life, in it. Yeah. Cool, thanks.
I had a question about whether other considerations were made, for example, if there's dampeners or the tone of the horn or anything that could make it less intrusive.
So
I don't know what the technology is for
the issue
that.
of the horn itself is something that was discussed at length when we had a public meeting. And the simple answer is there's an FRA standard for the level of sound that is emitted by the horn. And there are no devices that attenuate that sound. There's a particular threshold that needs to be met. The horns are manufactured to that specification, and the engineers operate them according to be compliant with these safety rules.
So you can't just put up drapes at a certain level and absorb it or something?
I think individuals have options that they can use within their premises, but with regard to the engineer and the railroad, I'm sorry that the safety standards seem to be the target that needs to be met.
Yeah.
So with the Amtrak line, is it that there are no crossings, or why is that not part of the plan?
So there are 2 crossings. One is in Gallup Park. It's a pedestrian crossing, and the other is Lakeshore Drive. Over the course of the almost 14 years I've been with the city, there have been numerous complaints about the Ann Arbor Railroad. There have been 0 complaints about the Amtrak or Norfolk Southern trains that operate on the Michigan line.
Okay.
All right, anything else? Cyrus?
This is probably a little bit further along, but this is probably also more applicable to some improvements rather than others, like medians and channelization. But like, is there going to be the opportunity, or is it part of the decision-making process to figure out how that coincides with street work that is already kind of planned and programmed?
I appreciate the question, and
I realize it's probably very early for that.
the consultant has made a recommendation in terms of a cost-effective scenario. So there's the minimum, there's cost-effective, and then there's maximum safety. And so depending on where we go as a community, the ability is to perhaps start with a minimum, and then over time, as you're suggesting, to install some of the supplemental safety measures as road reconstruction comes up or as opportunities present themselves. There are risks at achieving a minimum compliant quiet zone that would be ameliorated if you have the supplemental safety measures in addition to the signals and gates. So there is a rationale for it. It's beyond the amount of time we have to go into it here this evening.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, we have a presentation from Cynthia.
Good evening, everyone. Let me just get us changed over here. All right, I am pleased to be with you this evening and to present the work that transportation staff has performed on looking at some lane conversions for 2019. Just briefly, some of the objectives of the presentation this evening are that we really wanted to provide you with a little bit of history on how we got here with these particular projects and provide some results on the analysis that we have done for each of these segments and respond to any questions that you may have, acknowledging that you did receive a memorandum on this topic that had a lot of information in it. So I am going to sum up some of that stuff and put it all into context. A little bit about the project history. And we have several sources for these projects. Predominantly, these are projects that were identified in the non-motorized plan that have not been completed to date. So for those projects, we were going through and confirming that the analysis that was done as part of the 2013 update is still valid and these projects are able to move forward. Also, we have several requests that have come up over time that were incorporated into these projects as well. And I want to talk a little bit about our data sources. Some of the ADT data you may have noticed comes from various different places, and I wanted to point out to you all that the ADT data is really, that's your average daily traffic volume. So that's your first blush of, should we look into this or not? Since these were locations that we knew we wanted to evaluate thoroughly, we either collected data at the intersections for all of these locations. So we did turning movement counts. We did do some daily traffic count data collection as well. And there were some locations where we were able to use recent transportation impact analyses for data. Also, we pulled crash data from the statewide database, which is accessible publicly as well as through a couple different software packages that we use, and site observations. And I just wanted to point out the format of all the slides that I'm presenting to you this evening. So it's there's a location map to help you orient yourself for the segment that we're talking about, a little bit of pertinent data, and an image that shows what our proposed design is going to be. All right, the first road segment that I want to talk about is Green Road. And this segment includes Green all the way from Burbank down to Plymouth, but there's a break at Commonwealth so that you have a different design in both locations. This project will provide the opportunity to complete the bicycle network from Nixon Road all the way down to Glacier Way. And what we're looking at between Burbank and Commonwealth is currently a 4-lane cross-section. So the data supports that we will have sufficient level of service if we go ahead and make that reduction. We'll be able to provide that 2-way left turn lane for the driveways through there. And there's not a correctable crash problem that we'll be able to see a huge safety benefit from, but we expect to see a reduction in speeds. And we'll also be able to get those bicycle lanes in there. And then south of Commonwealth, where we already have a 5-lane cross-section that widens out to a 6-lane cross-section at the approach to Plymouth Road, we're actually able to narrow up lanes and go ahead and get those bicycle lanes in while maintaining that 5-lane cross-section. And down at the intersection, we are currently looking at dropping that right turn lane and making that the southbound a shared right through lane to accommodate the bicycle lanes with a little bit more ease down at the intersection. The next segment that we're looking at is Liberty between Maple and Stadium. My apologies. This is a really important connection for the bicycle network on Liberty and getting from downtown out to the edge of the city, about at least out to the bridge over US 23. Those of you who are familiar with this segment, and you can see from the traffic volume data, this is a very, very busy segment. The initial idea for this segment was to be able to drop lanes and reduce the cross-section by a full lane in each direction. When we did the analysis out here, we found that we were not able to pursue that particular strategy because the volumes are so high that the intersections start to break down. We have failing level of service at the intersections and with lots of spillback queuing, and a lot of problems come out of that. Looking at the length of the segment, we weren't comfortable trying to drop a lane in the middle of the segment and then widening back out at the intersections, which is a strategy that we have employed in other locations because we just don't have the length to really do all that tapering and that merging and diverging, and we would be introducing more problems. So what we're looking at currently, and I do look forward to getting your feedback on this, is reducing the lanes as much as we can and putting in a bicycle lane in both directions, but it would end up being a substandard bicycle lane that would end up with a 4.5 foot bicycle lane in each direction, which we all acknowledge is not an ideal scenario. It's not the most comfortable scenario, but it is a scenario that we can pursue to get bicycle lanes in this segment. Does anybody want to talk about that now or later?
Just a quick question. What's the speed limit right there?
30.
Okay, thanks.
The next segment that we're looking at is Oak Brook. Oak Brook's currently a 3-lane cross-section. It has very low volume on it. This street originally had a design concept that would have seen it as a complete parallel route to Eisenhower Parkway. That has not come to fruition. So we have this street that serves a lot of residential and a lot of retail. And it's a great opportunity to expand the non-motorized network and provide other mobility options for folks. The volumes are very low out here. Reducing the lanes out here would result in removing that 2-way left turn lane and having 1 lane in each direction and providing full bike lanes in both directions. We think we will be able to provide buffered bike lanes out here as well. This has not been designed yet, so these are conceptual sketches. But this is the option that we are pursuing at this location. Our next segment is Platte between Huron Parkway and Packard. And this is another location where we have a lot of traffic volume. It would be nice to be able to add bicycle facilities here. You have bicycle facilities that you would be connecting at both ends of this particular segment. You also have a lot of residential, you're connecting to retail. There are a lot of reasons why this would be a really great thing to do. But once again, in this segment, when we start reducing the lanes, we run into problems with capacity, particularly at the intersection of Platt and Packard, which is already a very distressed intersection. It has a lower level of service, and reducing capacity really puts that into failure as well. So we are recommending not pursuing this, but in saying that, staff also acknowledges that we need to do something out here. And the non-motorized plan does point to Elmwood as being the alternative low-stress route for this particular segment. We already have the widened sidewalks down on Packard to have that shared use component down there as a tie-in. And our recommendation at this point is to move forward with enhancing the Elmwood route. The next segment that we looked at was South Industrial. And this is the segment that runs between Stadium and Stimson, and then we also looked at south of Stimson. This is another very short segment that has a lot of traffic volume on it. Just like some of these other segments, we found that we do not have the excess capacity to reduce by a lane. And a lot of that has to do with those northbound left turns, and that we don't have a lot of storage between these two intersections, and failing level of service would result, which would end up with spillback queuing, and it would just multiply out the network. In this case, what we are recommending, we fully acknowledge is not a great solution, but we are looking at it as being an interim step. We would like to go ahead and mark auxiliary bike lanes out here to give prominence to non-motorized use of this corridor, but also we want to begin pursuing what the alternatives could be for a lower stress outside of the roadbed solution, such as a parallel route or looking at some wider sidewalks in that area that could be used as shared use. South Industrial, south of Stimson, however, does not have those capacity concerns, and it ties into the 3-lane cross-section with bike lanes that is south of this area. The analysis comes back with it being perfectly acceptable functionality to be able to do that, and we are recommending pursuing that lane conversion south of Stimson. The next segment that we looked at is Traverwood between Huron Parkway and Plymouth Road. This is another section that has a 3-lane cross-section currently. And we are recommending taking out that 2-way left turn lane to be able to use it for some other purposes. And you have already heard about this particular segment from Mr. Dykeman with his presentation on the road work that will be happening this summer. And I just wanted to reiterate that we are going to be addressing several types of resident concerns that have come up on this corridor with the design that we are proposing. We've heard concerns about parking and need for additional parking out there, and I would like to point out that we do plan to be installing the sharrows for the direction that doesn't have the bike lane. The bike lane will be installed for the uphill direction. That's our recommendation at this point. Now this last segment, I say this segment for last because I think it'll generate the most questions. This is Earhart between US 23 and Pine Bray. And for those of you who are familiar with this particular segment of road, it's wide. We have a wide median out here. We have 2 lanes in each direction. We have wide intersections. The road is really designed for far more traffic than it carries. And we have plenty of opportunity to convert some of this cross-section to be able to utilize it for non-motorized means. The recommendation of staff is to pursue a buffered bike lane out here, as well as some intersection reconfiguration. And what we are suggesting at this point would be accomplished with pavement markings, signs, and flexible delineators. There is no proposed changes to physical structure at this point. We do have a programmed project for this location that's a couple years out in the CIP. And we see this as a great opportunity to try out this design and be able to see how it's working and if there are any tweaks that we need to make before we make structural changes. The segment, this is an example of what the segment would look like. So we have the buffered bike lane, which is running the length of the segment, and it's a wide buffer. We are looking at using pigmented pavement, the green pigmented pavement in conflict zones where we have some of these wider intersections. This is at the northern end of the segment. And we're also looking at converting traffic control within the footprint of the existing intersection. This is Glacier Way and Earhart, to be able to provide a roundabout. You'll notice that there are some design features that are not necessarily what you would see in a standard roundabout, particularly the treatment of the bicycles and the way we're getting them around the bicycles. But this is an actual design drawing, so our design team has worked on this. And the roundabout is a little bit of a funky shape. It's more of an oblong about, but this is the shape that we needed to pursue to be able to get sufficient deflection for slowing and to control the fastest path through this particular location. So as you can see, we're maintaining the bicycle facilities. We are routing that bike lane outside of the roundabout, and it is not a final, to be built design, but it is a concept that we're working with, and we look forward to getting your feedback on. I would love to answer some questions.
So the bikes follow these crosswalks? Is that what the bikes do? I'm confused about where the bikes go.
The northbound segment is continued, and do I have, yes I do. So the northbound segment, the bike lane would continue outside of the roundabout. And if you wanted to make a left turn, you would need to, you have two options. You could either merge into traffic and use the roundabout, or you could come up and turn and cross as a pedestrian. Southbound gets a little different. We did a lot of back and forth internally as staff thinking about how we could accommodate this bicycle lane, particularly because we are trying to do this in a tactical approach without doing any concrete work at this point. So the solution that we came to was to also bring the bicycle lane along outside of the roundabout and to have this separate crossing right here, which it doesn't show up really well on your screens, I don't think, but there is the green pigmentation in there to show the conflict for the bicycles. Once again, it's a tactical solution. It would be in place for a couple of years.
Other comments or questions? You want questions about the whole presentation?
Sure.
Yeah, so is there any, I noticed like the protected bike lanes. I'm wondering what happens when you introduce those near where there are currently bus stops. Are there no cases of those, or?
That's a great question. There are various different ways that you could accommodate those. In a more permanent built-out condition, you might be looking at a floating island for the stop service, depending on the width that you're looking at. In this particular case, this would be tactical type work, so it's all paint and it's all delineators and those sorts of things. So we would be looking at treating the bus stops similar to how we are currently treating them out on 7th.
Which is how?
The bus pulls over to the curb
I see.
with that particular design. So that's something that we would be looking at in the near term. Longer term, that's something that could be looked at in more detail.
Okay.
If I may. I'm assuming all of these are more in the tactical direction, since we're not doing reconstruction on any of these segments anytime soon. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, with the exception of Traver.
Right.
Traver Wood, which will have, is being done in concert with the resurfacing project. And that there will be some bump out work with that one, and we're moving the parking by the library from being notched out and
Right.
moving it into what's currently the travel lane.
Yeah, because so in that context, I think I like the really creative approach here on your heart. I think it could work, and I've seen these oblong roundabouts in other places, and they do work. Because I think as we all get more familiar with them, as a way to get around that won't be too confusing. I mean, a lot of the sort of the simple stripe bike lanes, especially the Liberty Road segment, it's like maybe better than nothing from a bicycling perspective. Like I go up and down Liberty a lot. I don't go through that segment a lot, but even further down where we have those striped lanes, it's uncomfortable already, and at higher speed, more traffic out here. It's with the even narrower lane. Like same thing with Stadium. I bike on Stadium a lot, and it's terrifying. And so longer term, like I think if there's not room in the street right of way, like we need to figure out other options. And I think emphasizing the low stress network is one piece of it, but that's very much second classing cycling as a way of getting around. Like you can drive to every address in the city in a car safely and easily, but you can't get there on a bike. And so that's a much bigger conversation than I think these updates, which I think are good. I think to the extent that the bike lane gives us an excuse to narrow travel lanes, that's good, because that can have an impact on helping reduce speeds, which I think is great for safety. But as in terms of feeling like it's enhancing the cyclist experience, like it's barely. So directionally good. Like as somebody who likes to try to get around on my bike as much as I can, like it's always a little disappointing. But anyway, that's just kind of my feeling about all of the updates. But I do appreciate the direction everything is going in, and the creative tactical approaches, and really trying to balance everything, because we can make traffic a lot worse, and like the benefit also has to be there if we're going to do that. So.
Yeah, and we as staff definitely acknowledge that some of these recommendations are definitely not a preferred alternative. It's a step, an interim step, while we're looking for the better solution. One thing I do want to point out about this particular location that we have up on the screen, which is Earhart and Glacier, is, we looked at the performance of this location. We ran the analysis. We ran it through 3 different types of modeling to double check it, because they're not all exactly the same methodology. We wanted to make sure we checked this pretty well before we proposed it. In the peak 15 minutes of the peak hour, we have a slight lowering of level of service for Glacier Way. And of course, you're introducing delay to Earhart, but out here we have high speeds. Just to point out, we have, 38 miles per hour northbound and 42 miles per hour southbound. So we do have high speeds, we have speeding out on this corridor. So that's something that the introduction of this roundabout, and we're looking at another roundabout, the next intersection south, which would be a smaller roundabout at Waldenwood and Green Hills, which also still fits inside of the footprint of the existing intersection. So these intersections they're just huge. The most predominant crash pattern out here on this corridor is a right angle and a left turn crash. And a lot of it just has to do with the design of these intersections, and that they're so wide and they're so ambiguous, and you don't have really great sight lines. But during that peak 15 minutes of the peak hour, we do have a reduction in level of service. For the rest of the peak hour, the level of service stays steady. We as staff feel like that is a reasonable compromise for the benefit that we would get for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much for especially the creativity involved when things weren't working. And I will say that there's a caveat except for Platt. This is an intersection that I traverse through by car, by bicycle, by transit daily with a 7-year-old. Like, this one is near and dear, but it's also part of a bicycle community network that I can't tell you how important this is. This section is really important. Elmwood might solve some things, but cyclists traveling south are not going to wait for a signal to get onto Elmwood, come up to Elmwood, take a sketchy sidewalk with a whole bunch of, there's a gas station, there's auto sales, there's cars going in and out, and then wait 2 traffic signals, crosswalks, in order to continue south. So I was really hoping that you guys might be able to get creative and think about ways to address a creative solution on Platt. So for instance, the southbound backup, I totally get, but that's largely because there's a right-hand turn only lane at that intersection, right? And if you take away that right-hand turn, you're going to back it up even further. I'd love to explore the idea of a shared right turn lane and bike lane like what's currently on Stadium near Main. The other reality is that traveling north, there already is a road diet just south of that intersection. So there's really no queuing on that northbound segment of Platt until you get near the park down there near Edgewood. So we don't need all those 4 lanes in that corridor. You know, where can we get creative? There's also a frontage road near the uphill section that might make for a really interesting way to get people from the new bike lanes that are coming down Platt near the park, near, what park is that? No, County Farm. County Farm, you know.
County Farm Park is to the north, and the one.
So, yeah, the bike lanes are going to come now down to Platt, and you're going to have to cross the street to Elmwood, or it's no man's land still.
Yeah.
I would love to see some creative solutions. I understand why a road diet can't happen here. I know there's a ton of traffic. I know that there's a ton of backups because I sit in it. But a lot of that is due to that right-hand turn lane. So I guess a follow-up to, in the document, it says there's a high concentration of rear-end crashes at both signalized intersections on either end of the road segment, and a reduction in lanes would worsen the problem. That's new to me, that road diets increase rear-end crashes.
It can. It can. And
so could worsen the problem, not would worsen the problem.
well,
Sorry.
most likely it would. What we're looking, the stuff that's going on with that intersection, it's not just this particular approach. And something that's really interesting out here is that in the peak hour, we have more volume northbound than we have southbound, and a lot of that has to do with the turning traffic off of Packard as well.
Right.
So when we're looking at the corridor itself, we're looking at, you know, not only the through, but, you know, definitely all of those turns that are coming in and out. That intersection is so close to failing as it currently sits. Right. And we have tweaked and we have tweaked and we have tweaked that timing to the point where we can't really squeeze anything else out of it.
Right.
So with that reduction, that's what we were looking at. You know, it's looking at something like the shared use lane. It's something that we can go back and we can look at again. My concern is that the sharing would have to start so far north that we're not going to see a significant benefit from that. So I think looking at those other options that are outside of this corridor in it itself, looking at that frontage road, looking at, you know, Elmwood and making Elmwood more attractive, and what do we need to do to make it easier to move on those parallel routes. I think those are the things that are going to be worth investigating as we're moving forward, because we're going to be able to get more value out of those pursuits, in my opinion.
Yeah, thanks. One of the situations that happens on that southbound is that a lot of people aren't aware that it's a right-hand only turn up ahead. So it's even signaling that further. And so what you do is you have a lot of people, they're queue jumping, right? It's the hurry up and wait effect. It's the, I want to get here super fast so I can wait, even though I'm going to save 10 seconds overall in my trip. It sets up that conflict zone. So granted, you might have to start that bike lane further north than you might like in order to have the whole corridor, but also signaling that right-hand turn only early on would, you know, eliminate that queue jumping. And the other thing is that frontage road where there's residential is a beautiful road to bike up that hill. But it's just hard to get from the corner to there because there's so many intersections. Canterbury's right there. We have cut-through traffic trying to turn left. Like, it is, it's just an ugly part of town. So I don't know, maybe you and I could just go look at it and think about stuff. I don't know.
Sure.
That
would be great.
I would love to see some creative ideas with that road in mind. I know it's a problem area. I know you know that. So,
yeah, we have really, particularly on the east side, we have very limited right-of-way out there. So we're up against the edge out there. So, but on that west side, I think we would be able to pursue some more creative options.
Cool. Thank you.
I have a few more philosophical kinds of questions. I thought I heard you say a couple of times that because of the difficulty with trying to make this happen, you would be suggesting sidewalks for bicycles. There were 2 or 3 instances. And I understand reality is there, but just philosophically, I think that when we revert to sidewalks, that should be really highlighted that this is not the direction we want to go, and it's not appropriate, really, and it's an absolute last resort kind of a thing.
So in the case of South Industrial, our recommendation is to pursue those, marking the auxiliary lane, marking the fact that the bicycle has a right to be there, but then also looking for, in the longer term, looking for some lower stress alternatives. Because that even if you're a very active, competent, confident cyclist, you're not going to feel super comfortable riding on that section of South Industrial. It's just so busy and so congested, and there's so much going everywhere.
It's true of Stadium coming up to it as well.
Yeah.
It's bike path, no bike path, no bike path, no bike path.
But, you know, you do want to you probably want to get up into that neighborhood, maybe from work, further south on South Industrial, or from some commercial. So it's looking at that as an interim step, and let's look at what else we can do. Not stopping there, but let's do this for now, and let's look for the other alternatives.
Yeah, I understand that. I just want us to emphasize more that we don't really want to put bicycles on sidewalks because there's no other alternative. Yeah. But sometimes there is no other alternative.
Yeah.
And I also, you know, doing social media, reading too many comments, people seem to be pretty freaked out about road diets and not understanding them. And sort of as an intro to what we're going to be talking about later, that it really pertains to the 2 of the E's, which is engineering and education. And so I absolutely love road diets, and I really thank you for this presentation. And I think that they've been incredibly successful. where we've put them in, and just, I mean, really more successful than I ever thought. I was originally, I thought the original road diet proposed for Jackson 20 years ago was insane. And it's great to be wrong. So I think we need to do a whole lot more education about how much value there is and how much greater safety there is. And then people keep talking about, you know, stop the speeders, stop the speeders. And again, this is how you do it, the engineering aspect. And so I think we really need to highlight those two aspects of transportation, that this is education, hopefully, and engineering in action. And it's fabulous.
And Linda Diane, that's a perfect segue into what I was going to say to everyone next, and that's what our next steps are. We're going to be looking, you know, at pursuing more design and actually understanding what we need to do for design, but also we plan on taking all of these segments out to the public to get public input and feedback. Earhart will be a public engagement strategy all on its own. It's a very big change, and we want to make sure that we can bring the community along and make sure that everyone understands what the trade-offs are going to be and the value that that project has. We're also planning to do engagement strategies for all of these corridors. Green and Traverwood will be done together because they're so close to each other, so we'll be able to engage with a lot of the same people. And we want to get a little creative with some of our outreach that we do on this. We want to look at having a stronger online presence and being able to get more feedback from a broader population by having more of an online feedback loop.
And that's why we want to talk about education and stuff tonight a little bit, because I think you need to do some of the educational part before you ask for the feedback, too.
Yeah.
Or you'll have people reacting like I did. Because people can change their minds with information. And the argument for road diets is pretty compelling. Anyone else want to speak to this? All right, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Exciting things coming up. I believe the next thing on the agenda is a micromobility task committee report. And you have a couple of items here.
Yep, just a quick update. At our last meeting, we received the first draft of an ordinance from the city to that sort of updates the ordinance around bicycle usage to define personal mobility devices, and then clarifies how and where we expect those to be operating. So we had some back and forth with staff on that, and I'm expecting we'll see that incorporated into the draft that eventually comes here. We just had an update on what was going on with Bird and the Bird contract. Turns out they left the city, they came back to the city, they haven't been complying with their contract. I don't know if there's any more updates from then. But that was pretty much it. So we just had to review that draft ordinance, gave a little bit of feedback, kind of wrestling with how do we define these things so we're not permitting motorcycles on, you know, bike lanes, but allowing these new vehicle types, that lower powered vehicle types, some space where right now it's either ambiguous or they're sort of forbidden everywhere, but that wasn't really what we want to see happen. I don't know if Raymond has anything he wants to chime in on. He was at the meeting, but that was where we're at, and I think we're waiting for our next meeting. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Commissioners Kleiman and Trudeau. It is kind of funny in this brave new world, you know, we kept going through different examples of, you know, different forms of micromobility, and, you know, we talked about weight limits, and it's like, well, what, you know, does that affect cargo bikes and pedicabs? And then we talked about, you know, the engine type, and then does that affect, you know, e-scooters or e-bikes? We talked about whether it's one abreast or two abreast on, a bicycle. And then again, pedicabs and cargo bikes came into that discussion. So it's very interesting to kind of put parameters around what it is we're, talking about when we talk about this, just because, again, things are evolving and new things are coming into the fold more rapidly than they have in the past. So it's an interesting exercise, and again, I just really appreciate the insight of the commissioners who are involved in that, because it's helping us think through any unintended consequences that we don't want, right? I mean, we don't want to artificially restrict mobility in a way that, we would otherwise want to encourage. And so some of those devils are in the details, and trying to find kind of that right balance of, parameters while, allowing the system to kind of operate and the way that you want it to, while respecting everybody's, desires to get around safely and efficiently is it's an interesting exercise. So stay tuned. There'll be a lot more coming back for this group.
And just to add, for anyone that's keeping up with the Micromobility Committee meeting calendar, the calendar was updated to adjust the meeting. Instead of meeting February 11th, they will meet March 11th. And that will give staff time to prepare a second revision to the ordinance based on the feedback provided.
Anything else you need from us? Okay. The next item is the new council member orientation. And so the proposal was in your packet. If anybody has any additions or comments to that, that'd be fine, or else we'll just proceed. We just have to come up with some proposed dates. Okay. Didn't need all that time. And then we go to the 6 E's exercise. And essentially, we will start that next month. And so this is a heads up that we're going to be working to emphasize that approach a little bit more. It's endorsed by all kinds of cool people nationwide. The 6 E's are listed there. I won't dare do it by memory, but education, enforcement, engineering, encouragement, evaluation, and then equity is the one that many people leave off. So Raymond is going to be giving a presentation on that. If you have other people that you'd like to add to that educational effort, please let Kayla or I know. And if you have particular concerns or expertise or interest in one of those E's, the idea is to actually go away and have either single commission members or actually form a little temporary, like one-time committee to come back and say, this is where we need to work, this is what needs to be expanded. Any questions or comments about this process? It felt like something that we could actually do and create some, it's a framework to create some values and statements about where the commission is as well. And give a heads up to the transportation plan as well. This is one of many ways to provide input into that process.
And Madam Chair, if I may, just request from the commission that if they have any, in their travels or in, reading literature, if they've come across treatments that they've found particularly intriguing, that, they'd like to highlight, come prepared to speak to that, but you can also share it with me, and then I can try to incorporate it into the presentation. The presentation I was going to start with, it resembles very closely to what I gave at the WBWC meeting. Was that just last week?
Yeah, Bicycle Alliance.
Yeah.
WBWC.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The Bicycle Alliance meeting. And so, but I'd love to build on that based on, the feedback and the thoughts from this group as well. Mine was about my kind of experience and my journey, but I'd love to, hear from others, and we can kind of enter that into the discussion and then, kind of have, as you've suggested, kind of a workshop style where we can kind of discuss it as a group, as a whole, so.
Great. Brad?
Are we thinking this is going to be a one-time, or is this going to be ongoing for a while? I assume ongoing, but I don't know. What's the vision, sort of?
We're going to be flexible about that.
Okay, good, okay.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what we'd like to do is try to channel what comes out of this group into the transportation plan process. So then that way it can help inform, the direction that that's going from this body and kind of give it some structure around those 6 E's. I think that would be helpful. And then, through the public engagement, we can vet some of the ideas that come out of this group. We can vet those publicly as part of the public engagement, so there can be a feedback loop around that. So I think that's kind of the idea. And I only bring that up because to me, that's how we want to tie all this together. So, we don't want this process to outlast longer than the transportation plan. Obviously, we can continue on the 6 E's, right? It can be ongoing, but I would like to, bookend it at some point, so then that way we can say, okay, these are the recommendations we'd like, for consideration into the transportation plan, and then we can continue to monitor it or update it or things like that.
What's the timeline on the transportation plan start? Like, when would they need deliverables?
Sure. So, the transportation plan began in earnest just at this meeting last month. It's going to be about an 18-month process. Right now, they're in the data collection phase, right? So they're going around looking at all the past studies and compiling data, seeing what other data sources are out there. There's going to be some public engagement that we'll start launching soon. Right now, we're working on the public engagement plan is one of the things that we're trying to finalize. And so, I think if this commission, takes a couple bites at the apple, that's not going to be too problematic, but I wouldn't want it to kind of last too long, because then, the window starts to close a little bit in terms of trying to getting it into a meaningful way into the plan process.
I guess my concern is if we do 6 in-depth discussions, that, like, we could have half-hour discussions on
Sure.
each E, right? So if we could somehow spread it out or divide it up, part of it's information overload, but, education and encouragement. I would love to understand what other communities are doing. Here's
Right.
ideas,
Well, and part of the individual commission member or little tiny committee going off is to say, we need more on this aspect of this, or we want to come back and put this into our work plan later on. Definitely.
Yeah, that
So
sounds great.
it's a very much of a living, breathing thing.
I very much like it.
Yeah.
Cool.
As a follow-up to the bit about having individuals go off for the little reports and that, so I think it's up to you whether or not you want to discuss that more at your meeting tonight, of if those commissioners that are present, if anyone is interested in a particular E, if you want to start making those determinations now, or if, Linda, Diane, if you'd rather have people submit their requests for particular E's, but it might be nice to know that going into the March 20th meeting of who has responsibility for which item, to do a follow-up.
Yeah, there's so few of us that I would prefer that you let me know, either directly or through Kayla, and we can have some of that set up ahead of time,
Okay.
but give everybody an opportunity.
Good.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think just using that language more and more will also be really helpful for the community discussion in general. Okay, so next we have Howard Lazarus's report.
So anyone that is keeping up with the latest change to the agenda, what I printed for tonight and what is posted on Legistar currently removed Howard's update because he let us know that he was not going to make it
Okay.
to this meeting. So I went ahead and amended the agenda beforehand so that we wouldn't have to do it on the floor.
Okay.
And the update, one of the materials that Howard was going to speak to, is now rolled into the staff report,
Okay,
which may be the very next
yes.
item.
I'd love to hear what you have to say, Raymond. Can I mention before you start that this transportation plan update is now available online by subscription. And so if you even Google Transportation Commission, City of Ann Arbor, you can find our website that we have on the city page, the city site, and there's a little tab over on the right where you can say subscribe, and it'll take you where you can get this report on a regular basis. And so all of us can disseminate that information to other people. I already put it on the SOS Facebook page. But it's such a great report. I'd love to see more and more people have access to it. So that started. Thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you for the suggestion.
Yeah, I think it was a great suggestion. I mean, I think there's, it was kind of a shame we didn't have a Transportation Commission website up till now, but I think it's great that we have one and we have some good content. And then, this Gov Delivery update is a nice touch as well, so thank you.
We do have to
Madam
fix the
Chair.
link on the bottom, which only goes to 2/8, as far as 2018 for Legistar links, but.
Oh, okay. All right, so what I'll do is I'll go through, as is standard process, I'll go through and just kind of highlight the changes from last month to this month that related to transportation projects. Madam Chair just highlighted the first thing that I want to mention, which again, there's a standing website now as well as a Gov Delivery that you can get updates on. The next big highlight is under Scioto Church. We've been asked to set up a public meeting to hear concerns from neighborhoods about changes that were made at the 7th and Scioto Church intersection, as well as the 7th and Stadium intersection. So we're working on the details of what that'll be. There'll be more information forthcoming, but we're again hoping to set that up here relatively soon, and we'll inform this commission when that gets scheduled. I will note you may see some things that seem to be missing from the report, but what we're doing is we're kind of restructuring. A lot of the 2018 projects are now kind of falling off since 2018 is done, and we're focusing on the 2019 projects. And some of the work related to crosswalks, pedestrian improvements are under kind of a bigger section now related to some of the reporting we're doing to City Council, which is one of the things that Mr. Lazarus was going to report on tonight that I'll get to in just a minute. So that brings me on the bottom of page 2, starts the discussion about the crosswalk improvements. So again, I think we've mentioned to you before that Council passed Resolution R-18497, which required certain levels of reporting related to crosswalk improvements. The first was the crosswalk design guidelines, which took effect January 15th. And then at the end of January, we had a deadline to report on existing conditions, planned improvements, as well as an assessment of crosswalks and what's been done in the past 3 years. And so that information was, I believe, included in the packet. There's a lot of information in there, which is kind of interesting. So it shows that, in 2016, 2017, 2018, there were several hundred pedestrian improvement and crosswalk improvements that were accomplished. And in 2019, there's a fairly robust list of improvements that are identified in that list as well. There's also a inventory of significant pedestrian crosswalks and a high-level assessment of their consistency against the crosswalk design guidelines. So again, this idea of whether it's a standard crosswalk, a standard plus crosswalk, and so forth, and whether crosswalks kind of meet those standards or not. The one thing that I always like to underscore here is this really was done kind of at a systems level. So further analysis is probably warranted at some of these locations by kind of going out, field verifying, as especially ones that kind of jump off the page that need to be addressed. We required to go out there and look at those, and so this spreadsheet's kind of a good tool for us to use on an ongoing basis, and we'll continue to update that information. We do have a couple other pieces that we're still working on. One of them is to come up with an estimation of what it would cost to take all the substandard crosswalks and bring them into compliance. And so we're currently discussing that. That's another thing we'll be reporting up to council, and we'll share that information with you all as well. Just to temper expectations, it's not going to be a single number. It's going to probably be a range because, again, once there's a lot of variability at each crosswalk. Some crosswalks may require pedestrian refuge islands, may require rectangular rapid flashing beacon signs. And so it's, maybe it's just pavement markings, maybe it's just signage. And so what we're going to do is just come up with kind of a range for each treatment, and then kind of multiply that out based on, the crosswalks that are deficient. So that's what we're working on currently. And then starting in April, we'll be giving monthly progress updates on implementation efforts. And so again, this is something we'll share with this commission as well. On North Maple Road, restriping and crosswalk, you may recall that back in December, we held a public workshop soliciting input from the public about where new crosswalks could be on North Maple between Dexter and Miller. We had pretty good turnout. We had been promising that we would have an online tool, and I'm happy to report that that online tool went live today. And so we're, please share that among any of your groups. If you just go to the city's website and look up North Maple crosswalks, that page will pop up. It's also included in it's just the city's website /North Maple. And we'll be sharing that information from people who came to the workshop and gave us their contact information. We'll send that out to them as well. And possibly, I think we're hoping to post it on some social media channels as well. And the information that we're gathering through this tool is very similar to what was in the public workshop. It's a map tool. You can drag and drop a pin for a suggestion of where a crosswalk should be. You can add comments to it, and then it's kind of like a wiki, so other people can see your comment and like your comment. And so then it can kind of really show us where, kind of crowdsource where the most interest is for different locations. So we're excited to use kind of a new tool that we haven't used before in this way. All right. Scrolling down. Right now, I think there's been some updated language on the Ann Arbor STEAM Safe Routes to School project, starting on page 4, that really streamlines some of the language, but we are expecting to send the bidding documents to MDOT by the end of this month. So that project is moving forward. It has received all the council approvals up to date. There are 2 additional council approvals that will have to happen, but those are expected to be finalized by May. You heard tonight on road diets, so there's some new information there, but you've gotten the best information from Cynthia. And there's also some new information related to the quiet zone, but again, you heard from Eli this evening about that. There's also some updated language about the Washtenaw-Pittsfield crosswalk. Things are moving forward with that project. This is one of those projects that the language hasn't changed month to month a lot. But we are finally kind of making some traction with MDOT for a new pedestrian crossing at that location, which is pretty exciting. Another big one, actually there's a meeting tomorrow, traffic calming, Scio Church Service Drive, which is that little service drive that runs parallel to Scio Church by 7th. The first project meeting will be tomorrow evening. What time is that, Cynthia?
It's at 6:15.
6:15, and it's at
Dicken Elementary School in the multi-purpose room.
Okay, there it is. 6:15, Dicken Elementary, Scio Church Service Drive traffic calming project kickoff meeting tomorrow. All right. I think that is. I'll get to that one in just a second. There are 2, there's some new language related to Sustainability and Energy Commission. We're trying to, connect some dots, and I think this was a recommendation, I can't remember if it was from this commission or from the Energy Commission, or about, some of our work kind of crosses over a little bit, and so it seemed like there was an opportunity for us to share information across those 2 sectors. So there's a Sustainability and Innovations update from Dr. Missy Stoltz in her office, and there's some information related to electric vehicles, a volunteer program for solar installation, and then the annual Ann Arbor Green Fair as well. And then for the Energy Commission, there's some discussion also about electric vehicle subcommittee ordinance and some of the things that are that group is working on. So again, there's some overlap with transportation, and this is something that we'll probably be including on our monthly report as well. Then the last thing I want to highlight is under the Speed Reduction Committee recommendations, which talk about dedicated funding and staff. So I'm very happy to announce that we've completed our recruitment for a new employee, a new transportation engineer that will start in March. It's someone that I think you all know because he sits on this board. Mr. Cyrus Nahidi is actually going to be our new transportation engineer. Yeah, we are super excited about it. You know, Cyrus has a tremendous knowledge in the subject area. I think he understands the direction that we're trying to go as a department, as a city, and I has just a wealth of knowledge and experience that I think is going to come in very handy. So the entire team is really excited to have him start. Cyrus, I've already been telling people that you're going to hit the ground jogging. You know, we'll let you. One thing I learned is that the honeymoon period is very short at the city of Ann Arbor. No, I think it's great. The fact that you're kind of tied into some of the discussions and understand some of the issues that we're dealing with. I couldn't think of a better candidate for this position, and we're super happy to have you come into the city.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm excited as well. It's nice to know that work with the city will continue on a much more full-time basis. And, you know, one part of that does, one sort of side effect of that is that I will have to step down from the commission, which does not mean the end of us seeing each other. I'll probably be helping Cynthia out on the podium side of things at some future meeting, and, you know, obviously in more informal and other capacities as well. So, but yeah, I guess this is officially my last meeting on this side. So, thank you.
And Madam Chair, that concludes my
Thank you.
updates.
All right.
Oh, I got a couple quick questions for Raymond. But first, just want to congratulate Cyrus and say, working on the CIP committee, I've seen your level of expertise and care. And Ann Arbor, the city is lucky to have you, and I'm thrilled.
Hear, hear.
So, yeah, it's very exciting. So Raymond, we don't have to get into it tonight much, but I'm curious, the SIO Church meeting, I imagine there's going to be lots of feedback about the lane changes and that kind of thing. And I'm curious as well in that corridor how the advisory bike lanes are going on 7th, which is connected right, captive audience. And I know Cynthia has some of those going into some other areas that couldn't fit traditional lanes. I'm just curious, it's such a new treatment. How's it going? What's the feedback? Cyclists seem to like it. I don't know how drivers feel. I feel much safer on 7th. Maybe that's something we could discuss for Platt in certain areas. Like I'd like to know more. So while you have your ear to the ground, maybe you can just have that.
No, and I appreciate that. I will say I've heard similar feedback as you have, that cyclists seem to like it. You know, I think the intent of the advisory bike lane, especially as you approach the intersections, the idea is meant that it's a shared lane type configuration, but what seems to be happening is that cars are actually kind of respecting that dashed line, moving closer to the center line, allowing room for the cyclists to actually, you know, kind of coexist side by side through the intersection. So, yeah, I think for that reason we've heard positive things, and we haven't heard a lot of complaints about it from motorists and others. So, you know, I think that suggests that there seems to be some support for them.
Yeah,
so.
it's an interesting treatment that you know, I haven't heard much other communities doing it all that much, and so I'm really curious. This is an exciting one to keep pursuing.
And there will be new treatments proposed as part of, you know, obviously as we do
surface treatments and pavement markings, there's opportunities elsewhere, but the one that's kind of on the horizon that we're aware of is as part of the William Street project as well. There's some advisory bike lanes that are proposed as you cross further west, and kind of the western edge of the project, as you start to transition to the neighborhood.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was really excited to see this crosswalk assessment document, but I was confused, and I wondered if you could
Sure.
kind of talk me through it. So, you mentioned that substandard crosswalks would be addressed. So those are the cases where the existing design is lower quality than the target design, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so there weren't very many of those. There were a few where they were standard, but the target is standard plus. And then there were a lot that had insufficient data or under review. There were a
Yeah.
few on state that were from standard to high risk.
Right. And so that would be an example where,
Okay.
yeah. And with the insufficient data, some of them, we felt like we probably need to go out and, some of this was done again at kind of a high level. So with the insufficient data, what we need to do is kind of just go out and do some field verification in terms of what the existing conditions are. A lot of this exercise had to do with really kind of stitching together a lot of different data sets that we have that are kind of spread out throughout the city. And so we were able to kind of, come up with a process that identified, where we have RFBs, where we have signage, where we know we have continental crosswalks, things like that. But, some things may predate where we have really good data at that, and so there's just the need to go out and verify. And, given the hundreds that we had to analyze and the amount of time that we had to do, we kind of try to acknowledge that there's still some work to be done on them.
Okay. So I was expecting that the existing design column would correspond to information in these 6 columns on the right-hand side, but they don't necessarily. So like, for example, the first, if you look at Church Street, which is high risk, but it doesn't seem to be any different than the standard pluses in terms of what features it has. So I just didn't understand what that means, that it's existing design is high risk, but yet it seems to have the same features as the standard plus.
Sure. So I think if you go back to, and I'll kind of look over at Cynthia from time to time to make sure that I'm explaining this coherently. So if you remember back to the crosswalk design guidelines, it was kind of a flow chart or, like a decision matrix or decision tree in terms of how it works. And so there's several different things that would go into whether a crosswalk merited, a standard treatment, a standard plus treatment, or a high-risk treatment. And a lot of that has to do with, vehicle volume, speeds, if there's a safety, if there's a crash history at that location. So you're right, there might be some, roadways or some crosswalks that, have different treatments but are classified differently, and that has to do with the characteristic of kind of the surrounding area and the characteristic of the roadway that surrounds it. And so this, and another way to help explain how this was developed is the entire city was kind of broken into like 30 or so chunks, different kind of, what was that, 50? Okay. About 50 different analysis zones. So, and what that really related to was, kind of breaking down corridors that had similar characteristics, both in terms of, posted speed limit, traffic volumes, and then kind of knowing what we know about those existing crosswalks and kind of analyzing them in that fashion. And so again, that was a way to kind of go through the process at kind of this high level systems-based approach and kind of identify areas where there's, additional attention that's needed. But again, I think there's further refinement is definitely needed. And so, we welcome any like suggestions and feedback or things that we need to kind of revisit. It's definitely something we want to hear from you all on.
I don't know if you can address this, Cynthia. Like that Church Street crosswalk, that's right where I work. And it seems like a very, very basic crosswalk to me, and so I don't understand why the design is considered a high-risk design.
I can't recall everything
Okay.
about Church Street off the top of my head. But what I can speak to is that it will partially be what the functional classification of the roadway is and the road width. So those different brackets, there are groupings of treatments for those brackets based on the road type. So if you're in a neighborhood street, high risk looks much different than if you're on a 3-lane arterial or a greater than 3-lane arterial or a collector street. And that's probably where some of that going back and being able to understand where it fits into those suite of treatments.
Yeah, I wonder if we need a column like that that says what category it's in. I had a real hard time mapping these columns with pedestrian island, RRFB, lighting, bump out. I had a hard time mapping those onto the risk categories of the existing design. And yeah. And another question I had, which isn't maybe all that directly related to this, but it has to do with how things get coded the same way even though they're different. So like the signage on these 3 Dexter Avenue are all coded yes for signage sufficient, but they're different. Like one of them has signage on both sides from both directions, and the other 2 have only signage on one side from each direction. And it's the same little strip of Dexter. So I don't understand the inconsistencies.
Well, I think that's, I think this is feedback we welcome, right? So I
Uh-huh.
think that's one of the things that we can look into more. Again, when we look at kind of, at a GIS level as a first kind of screening, we look at some of the different assets that are identified. So we look at signage, we look at, and so, to your acknowledgement, there are signs out there, but are they consistent? Well, maybe that didn't pop up as part of this, exercise just because of how many we were analyzing and kind of the scale that we were doing it. But again, I think it's something, especially for those that are really familiar with certain areas, we'd love to make this as kind of accurate as possible and continue to kind of update it and refine it. So we welcome that input. Yeah.
Okay, great. And the insufficient data and under review categories, are those different?
Yeah, I think, so under insufficient data, some of that had to do with whether we had existing GIS layers or existing data sources that we could readily pull from that could help with it. And so sometimes we weren't, we may have to go out and fill in some of those blanks. And then what was the other?
Under review.
Yeah, I think under review, Cynthia, you can maybe remind me on that one. I think it had to do with kind of a similar, if I remember, insufficient data was related to the existing condition and target design, and then under review, let's see, was that? Trying to find an example of the under review. Oh, okay, there, it's under the same header. Yeah.
I think, if I'm recalling correctly, that might have been a location that was not necessarily under our jurisdiction, the under review.
No, I think these
No?
are some
Like,
looking at Madison
yeah.
and Liberty and some others.
Hoover.
Well, you
Yeah.
can discover it and get back to us then.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it does underscore, the need for us to continue to refine it and update it and kind of continue to plug in information. And so I appreciate that, comment
Yeah.
and that acknowledgement there.
Well, I'd be very interested in being kept up to date on
Sure.
the, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And we'll find a place for this, sorry, Kayla, find a place for this to live. Right now, it's just been kind of transmitted through, to city council and to this commission. We're going to find a good place on one of our transportation-related websites where we can kind of upload, the most recent information. Yeah.
Just a question for Raymond and Cynthia, as follow-up to Commissioner Boland's feedback about specific locations. Is what you heard here tonight sufficient for follow-up, or would it be helpful to have a follow-up email or something that cites locations where maybe you've seen something on the ground different than what is reflected in the report?
I mean, I think I understand that this was put together relatively quickly because you had a strict deadline, and that it's an evolving document, so it'll get more refined. And so I guess I want to see how it
Yeah.
gets refined before I.
Yeah, if I'm understanding correctly, maybe spending some time to update the fields that seem to be incomplete, like the under review and insufficient data. And then from there, if any of you have any specific suggestions, or if if something doesn't pass the gut check for you, let us know, and then we can kind of work with you on that, or we can go field verify some stuff as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Any other demanding questions on that? Great. Then we're talking about liaison reports from those who represent an agency or group. Any reports? Okay. Any communications from commissioners that we need to hear? Okay. And then we have next agenda items, if anybody has anything to suggest, to add to the agenda for consideration. All right, and you could, of course, let us know in between.
And I can give an overview of what I anticipate based on the work plan and our discussion so far tonight. So we will have the 6 E's discussion. There was the administrator update from Mr. Lazarus originally planned for tonight. I think he'll still want to have a little bit of time on next month's agenda. The CIP committee will likely have a report. They do have a meeting coming up currently scheduled for March 6th at noon in the first floor north conference room at City Hall for anyone following the activities of the CIP committee. And then on our work plan, we had anticipated a Highway Safety Improvement Program grant presentation from Cynthia, pending what we hear back about grant applications submitted. So that's yet to be determined. And then I'll also need to follow up with Eli, but we had put a placeholder for an Ann Arbor Station update from him as well, and we'll see if that's still on track. So I think it'll be a full agenda for March 20th.
All right. Great. If there are no objections, then I will call the meeting adjourned. We're adjourned.